Aircraft carriers are a sign of a country's military strength. We are not saying the more aircraft carriers you have, the stronger you are. But if you were going to use one thing to measure raw military power, aircraft carriers are not a terrible yardstick. Eugene Burton Ely completed the first successful takeoff from the deck of a naval ship back in 1910. Additional vessels were quickly modified to deploy aircraft, and by 1927, the U.S. Navy had constructed 2 aircraft carriers of the Lexington class, which served as the cornerstone for a fleet. With far more carriers than any other nation combined, the U.S. continues to have the biggest carrier fleet in the world. Yet, aircraft carriers are much more than just large, flat ships on which jets take off and land. Welcome to Get Around How. In today's video, we'll be looking at some mind-blowing facts about aircraft carriers. If you've ever seen an aircraft carrier, or better yet, if you've been on one, you'd imagine that it must have cost a lot to make, as these things are huge and feature some of the most advanced technology available. But if you were to guess precisely, how much would you say they cost? 100 million? A billion? Try this on for size. Each average aircraft carrier costs about $4.5 billion to produce. So it's no surprise a lot of countries don't even have one. This should be expected though, because being on an aircraft carrier means you're pretty much standing on 5 acres of steel. Aircraft carriers are nothing short of an engineering marvel. But the thing that powers these giant ships is even cooler, or should we say, hotter. As is expected for something of that size, aircraft carriers are not powered by regular gas. 2 A4W nuclear reactors, each providing 260,000 horsepower, can propel 4 propeller shafts at a maximum speed of 30 knots for all Nimitz-class carriers. The purpose of these reactors is to generate heat through fission. The propeller is powered by the steam propulsion turbines, and the ship's electric power is also produced by additional turbines. The process repeats when the water is pumped back through the system as the steam cools and condenses back into the water. Crew access to the nuclear reactor compartment is forbidden when the reactor is operating, in order to shelter the crew from the radiation generated by the reactor. Radiation monitors worn by reactor engineers are checked often. To reduce exposure to radiation, they meticulously schedule the job, work in shifts, and adhere to tight safety measures. Nimitz-class aircraft carriers may function for up to 20 years without refueling, since they are powered by these nuclear reactors. But America isn't the only one to innovate when it comes to these giant vessels. In the field of aircraft carriers, the Japanese are pretty impressive too. Japanese soldiers sought a strategy to outmaneuver American forces during the Second World War. They needed something out of the ordinary, as the U.S. was a formidable foe with a larger force and extremely powerful weapons. So they developed the I-400 class of submarines as a result. These devices were gigantic, measuring 400 feet long and weighing 6,560 tons. They were built to carry 3 bombers, 37,500 miles between refueling stops. The bombers were kept in a hangar that was 115 feet long and had an 85-foot catapult to launch them. They also equipped the bombers for water landing so they could maneuver through the confined spaces available on these aircraft carriers. They could be retrieved and returned to the sub using a crane. To fit within the hangar, the tail and wings were folded up together with the fuselage. Pretty incredible, right? Unfortunately for the Japanese, the war ended before any of these submarines could perform their intended objective, and just 2 of them were ever launched. If there is one thing that Top Gun taught us about aircraft carriers, it is that landing and taking off from one of these is an exhilarating experience. But the foundation of all that high-octane exhilaration is a grave danger. The majority of pilot fatalities are actually caused by factors like spatial disorientation, not hostile aircraft, which is something that movies leave out. Pilots are usually vulnerable to somatographic illusions. This occurs when there is rapid acceleration or deceleration, like when a pilot takes off or is trying to land. Your body feels like it is tilting upwards as you accelerate, and deceleration has the opposite effect. While somatographic illusions are just illusions, if you react to them the way some pilots have in the past, the result could be deadly as you compensate for movement that is not happening. You feel this way because of your inner ear. On takeoff, A pilot aboard an aircraft carrier could feel the urge to lower the nose of his plane because they think their angle of approach is too high. They may practically plunge off the side of the carrier into the water as a result. This illusion can force them to overcompensate and crash, which is one of the reasons why many aircraft carriers utilize catapult launchers for their planes and why pilots don't even touch the controls until the jet has been launched from the deck. The most recent Ford-class aircraft carriers in the fleet were built at a cost of roughly $12.8 billion. Obviously, the U.S. military has the best aircraft carriers available, and their technology is a little more advanced than that of other nations. But this does not mean that an aircraft carrier in the UK, China, or Brazil is made of sticks and stones. However, these ones can occasionally be purchased for a discount by people who are interested in having their own carrier. The Sao Paulo, owned by the Brazilian government, was put up for auction in 2019 with bids beginning at $1.25 million. The carrier had been bought by the nation 10 years earlier for more than $12 million from France. The depreciation is enormous, just like with cars. Being built in 1963, the Sao Paulo was the oldest operational aircraft carrier in the world. Due to the extensive repairs that were required and a string of tragic incidents, including an explosion and a fire, Brazil was hardly ever able to utilize it throughout the years that they had possessed it, and had to retire the carrier in 2017. Unfortunately, the ship was sold for scrap in 2021. Brazil tried to sell a different carrier, the Minas Gerais, in 2003, but the listing was removed due to eBay's prohibition on the sale of military-grade equipment. Have you ever thought about how an aircraft carrier gets to a scene in a Hollywood film? Well, many films employ stock footage of aircraft carriers, particularly during aircraft takeoffs and landings. This usually doesn't play a significant role in the storyline, therefore it's not a major concern. However, Top Gun 1986 was about pilots who, in a very realistic way, spent a significant amount of time flying to and from aircraft carriers. At the time, CG realities were not yet invented, so another solution had to be found. Tony Scott, the director of the movie, was able to persuade the Navy for permission to utilize the USS Enterprise and a group of fighter planes. The studio spent a lot of money to use the equipment on the aircraft carrier, which included paying around $8,000 per hour for the aircraft's fuel. Yet the USS Enterprise itself incurred one of the most notable expenses. Tony Scott thought that a certain moment in the movie could be better illuminated if the sun were shining from a different angle. The carrier needed to be rotated as a result. Scott had to personally sign a check for $25,000 to cover the expense of moving the carrier's location. The fact that an aircraft carrier operates at all is among its most astounding features. A carrier of the Ford class can carry 100,000 tons. It seems unbelievable that a steel vessel of such magnitude could ever move on water. Before, wood was the only material used to construct ships because of its floating ability, and even then, it needed some scientific ingenuity to modify ship designs for boats that would otherwise sink. When we think of any form of boat, wood and steel are perhaps the most prevalent materials that spring to mind, although polymers and fiberglass also have their place. Steel, however, is the only material that can be used to build an aircraft carrier, or so we thought. Jeffrey Pike was entrusted with creating a ship that could never sink for an aircraft carrier. To do this, he decided to create it from ice. The British military accepted Pike's suggestion and, for some reason, believed it was brilliant. Pike suggested using a material called pykrete, which is a blend of 85% water and 15% wood pulp, to create the aircraft carrier. The resultant ice was remarkably strong yet still usable. Bullets and torpedoes barely harmed the ice at all, but you could easily manipulate it and even cut off chunks to create the structure. Project Habakkuk, Pike's invention, was quickly imported to Canada. A proof-of-concept model was constructed in an Alberta lake by the Canadian military in response to Winston Churchill's request for one that was 2,000 feet long. The final product was 60 feet long and 100 tons in weight. Although the full-scale model was never completed, it took more than a year for the test model to melt before the project was finally shelved.